I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. I want to kick off today's segment with a big announcement. Next week, there'll be a special edition of On Watch. It'll be a 60-minute show featuring yours truly, Judicial Watch senior attorney Michael Bekesha, who's a brilliant attorney who's involved in an awful lot of our toughest litigation. We'll also be joined by Rachel Bovard from the Conservative Partnership Institute. She knows a whole lot of stuff about what's going on in Washington, D.C., a lot of behind-the-scenes insights from Rachel. And then also Mary Walter, who is the morning co-host of the Drive Time radio show on WMAL, Mornings on the Mall. And Mary has some great insights, not just from the perspective of breaking news on a day-to-day basis, but she has, this is part of a call-in talk radio show, and she has some pretty unique insights, because when the government goes home to bed at night and then drives into work in the morning, it's her show they're listening to. And so she's got a great cross-section of people calling in. She's up on all the latest news, and Mary will have some great insights. So I'm looking forward to a very exciting show next week. It'll be streamed on our Facebook site and then also rebroadcast on One America News Network over the weekend. So this is an exciting new development for us. We're looking forward to it. We think it's going to be very interesting, a lot of fun, and I hope that you tune in either via live stream or on One America News Network. So today I want to talk to you about probably the most egregious, glaring example of the disparity of treatment and the outrageous corruption in the FBI with respect to Hillary Clinton's email server and then the follow-on phony Russia hysteria that you've been lied to for the last 2+ years. And the example that I want to use is documents and information that we just released, just broke news on this yesterday. And my colleagues who are helping to develop this video will put a link in to the individual press release and all the documents attached to it, so that when you watch this, you can click on what I'm talking about and read for yourself the documentation. But here's the killer. This is just outrageously insane and shows the level of corruption at the FBI. And this corruption runs deep. I know that there are some folks out there who say, oh, 99% of the FBI is wonderful. That's baloney. Maybe 75% of the FBI is wonderful. But there's a leadership element at the FBI that is outrageously corrupt. And its best example is 218 pages of documents we got yesterday, showing how the FBI General Counsel, James Baker, bent over backwards to hurry up and release to Hillary Clinton and her attorney, David Kendall, all the investigative materials, the 302s. The 302 is an FBI report of investigation about her outrageous violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 793F, which is mishandling of national defense information. You will recall that Mrs. Clinton had this outlaw email server that she sent 22 top secret sensitive compartmented information emails across, along with a ton of other classified information. And then there's an investigation of it. It's a foot-dragging exercise. You all know that Comey, months before the investigation was ever closed, had formulated his answer, which was that he was not going to move forward on it. That investigation grinds along. In July, he has a press conference where he says, well, you know, maybe they did some bad things with respect to mishandling the information or being careless. He deliberately avoids the language in the statute, which talks about the mishandling of national defense information. And then Comey invents this whole new element of the crime about intent, which is not in the statute. So we're all aware of Comey's outrageous twisting and turning of the law, his abuse of power and discretion, his drawing a conclusion that only the Attorney General could draw legally. But behind all of that, in the next 2-month period leading up to the investigation, we now have documents showing the direct coordination between Hillary Clinton's lawyer, David Kendall, and James Baker, the General Counsel for the FBI, and the extraordinary lengths the FBI General Counsel, and in fact the entire FBI leadership went to bend over backwards to provide documentation, investigative reports to David Kendall and Mrs. Clinton. So think of the disparity of treatment here. You've got the leadership of the FBI throwing an investigation. The whole thing was a fraud. It was phonied up from day one. They deliberately overlook this compromise of classified material, and then ditch the investigation, stall any legitimate prosecution of Mrs. Clinton as a national security criminal, and she should have been prosecuted for that, in order to preserve her status as the Democratic nominee for the presidency. Simultaneously, this same crowd manufactures this scheme, this hoax, to go after then candidate Trump, later President-elect and then President Trump, to go after him personally, but also to go after the people around him within his campaign. The difference in tone, in language, in conduct and behavior could not be any more stark. In one case of Mrs. Clinton, the most senior leadership doing everything under the sun, moving heaven and earth to provide records, documentation, to back up and support not just her story about what she did to obstruct justice, destroying emails, bleach-bitting her server, hammering BlackBerries. You want to talk about obstruction of justice? Go look there. You have that conduct and that facilitation of all that by the FBI leadership, and then flip it around and then look at what was done with respect to candidate Trump and then President Trump, and then others around him for that matter. Think about how General Flynn was treated. Do you think if either President Trump, candidate Trump, let's say, or even General Flynn had said, hey, listen, my attorney's going to contact you, FBI. I'd like copies of all the documents you have on me. Do you see the disparity? This is the very definition of corruption and hypocrisy. And you know, I pray to God, literally, that Attorney General Barr looks at this. It is a perfect example at the complete split between the incredibly outrageously corrupt leadership of the FBI, the Department of Justice, and how they dealt with David Kendall and Mrs. Clinton in their candidacy walking up to the election in 2016, and then the polar opposite, the deliberate, malicious, unlawful targeting of candidate Trump, President Trump, and his campaign officials in an effort to get him. And they manufacture a phony story. We go through 2.5 years of lies and double talk. And even now, with the Mueller report having come out, and Mr. Mueller having concluded there was no collusion, there was no coordination with any Russians, exploding the myth all by itself, you still hear lunatics screaming about obstruction. Well, you know, there's any number of issues that are very problematic with respect to the second volume of the Mueller report when it comes to obstruction. And they've been discussed ad nauseum. I'll briefly touch on them here, just in the fact that if there's been no crime, how can you obstruct it? That's problem number one. And then problem number two is, in this country, we don't write reports on how someone didn't commit a crime. That's not how it works in the world of prosecutions. You either charge somebody or they walk. It's one way or the other. And so another glaring instance of incredible disparity of treatment and corruption from Mr. Mueller. So here we are, two very different stories, two very different tracks, two very different sort of courses of conduct by very senior officials. One, where they're incredibly deferential to Mrs. Clinton and to her attorney, David Kendall. The other, falsely demonizing, is a great word. It's called calumny. It's an archaic, it's an ancient word in modern day America. But calumny is false swearing to destroy someone's reputation. And this is the very definition of it. And so the disparity, the corruption could not be any more clearer in this recent set of documents, the 218 pages we've gotten. And I encourage you to go to our website, to look at the documents yourself, to read their own language when they're talking back and forth about preparing documents, releasing them to Mr. Kendall, the fight over whether Mr. Kendall was even authorized to have documentation from Mrs. Clinton that was highly classified, that he was holding in his safe in his office. This is really interesting stuff. It's the actual documents themselves. Even if you don't take my personal interpretation or my editorial slant on this, great. You go read the documents yourselves and see what was going on between these various characters. That's the important thing for us, is we get these records and we make them public so that you can understand what was really going on and you can see the corruption that was taking place. And it also provides an excellent perspective for analyzing all the crazy arguments you hear now about obstruction. Ask Mrs. Clinton about obstruction when she destroyed documents after receiving a subpoena. Ask Mrs. Clinton about obstruction when it comes to bleach bidding or server. Ask Mrs. Clinton about obstruction with respect to taking a hammer to BlackBerries and cell phones. If you're looking for obstruction, start there. So with that, I think I've given you enough of a background sort of teaser. Look at those documents. Go to our website, judicialwatch.org. I think you'll have a great example to show the near corrupt schizophrenia within the FBI and the Department of Justice and how these cases have been treated. And I certainly hope that Attorney General Barr and his staff go over it with a fine-tooth comb, because there's a wealth of information there. And as I close, let me remind you once again, next week, a special edition of On Watch with some great guests, streamed on our Facebook page on next Thursday, and then available all weekend long at One American News Network. We're really excited about it. We think it's going to be a great show, and we hope that you join us. I'm Chris Farrell, On Watch.